Greg, good afternoon.
Hey.
Thanks for joining us.
Sure.
This is Greg Russinger, Senior Pastor of the Alongsiders Church here in Eastside, Portland, Oregon. Greg, I'm really curious about your journey in ministry up to this point, but especially something that seems to be like a recurring theme in your life, which is this idea that a life interrupted is a life inspired. What do you mean by that, and how has that had expression in your life?
Yeah, it is a motto that I try to live by. It's a motto I keep coming back to in different seasons of my life. And it actually all started when I was in Ventura, California. We had, about kind of late 90s, we had started a kind of a very artist-based, very social-focused church plant, faith community in that area. So it was quite young, quite expressive. And as part of that experience and expression, we would host independent film nights.
Really?
We had a kind of a film and photography college in the area, so we would connect with them on some of that. And on one particular evening of one of the film nights, kind of the film and theology discussion stuff, the movie of choice was a movie called Lilia Forever.
Okay.
And Lilia Forever was a very, very difficult film to watch as a man, because it really showed you the finer points of human trafficking. And it was a Russian-based film, but in that day, it wasn't kind of human trafficking didn't have the trend and the followership that it does today. And so then it was definitely an under the ground conversation. And when I saw that film, I was really kicked in the gut. And as a man, I think universally there's an implication.
Sure.
And so it really, that phrase, that motto really came out, because in that night and on that particular film, in that setting, I was really interrupted. And what I began to learn as I began to write this motto down was that I think most people look for a sense of inspiration. What can I be inspired by? So they give themselves to different environments. They do whatever they can to find a sense of inspiration. And that's really important. But what I learned is that typically inspiration could be short-lived. The experience could be done, the relationship could be over, whatever it might be, and then the inspiration fades. But if there's an interruption, if there is something that's taken a hold of you and you can't shake it, nor should you, it actually breeds a sustainable inspiration. So when I say a life interrupted is a life inspired, that's what I mean of always being open and attentive to the interruptions in life, because when you are interrupted by something that matters, something that's taken a hold of you, then the inspiration behind the interruption will have a sustainability outside of just people pursuing some form of inspiration because of the lack in their life or the need in their life or whatever. So that was the film, that was the impetus of my interruption that really led then into some really actionable areas. We started One Voice to End Slavery and had got on multiple collegiate university environments for 10 years running, hosted some of the major events in all of the Southern California region and beyond during that time where that particular social injustice was really still under the radar.
Sure. So, my goodness. So you, from watching one film, came over a decade's worth of activism and involvement to address a very real need in the world. And it was that sense of that interruption, that I cannot continue to go forward with this being the case without addressing it in some way. That kind of provided the fuel and the framework to keep you going for over 10 years.
Yeah. I think film is meant to manipulate you. Film is meant to, bring to the surface emotion, laughter, connection. And I think film, out of all the different story forms today, I think that still has tremendous power. So the interruption was based on the fact that, number one, I wasn't really attuned to what was happening. Number two, as a man, if you're not interrupted by this type of exploitation, then there's something wrong with your manliness. And then just three, what part can I play in somehow bring in awareness and to the issue? And that's what we gave ourselves to.
I find it fascinating, especially in light of kind of a current cultural context that really emphasizes finding and following your passion. But what I'm hearing you say is find and follow the thing that interrupts you.
Yeah. Once again, I think passion's important. I think all the purpose is important. Meaning is important. All of these things matter. But the thing that I'm finding most is when there is a interruption, when something has once again taken a deep hold of who you are, knowing that you can't shake it, you can't create busyness to somehow overshadow it, and it just resonates and stays with you for any period of time, then you know you have to pay attention to it.
Yeah,
so.
Absolutely. I'm fascinated by your experience early on in ministry in Southern California, working with artists and Imagineers and dreamers. What gift do you think that people who excel in the visual arts, in storytelling, can give to the church?
Yeah, a lot. I think there's a deep prophetic sense. I think there's a deep compassionate empathy aspect to things. I think it's just, it's like the word became flesh and then we returned the favor, meaning we made the flesh become word again.
Oh.
So we have a very verbalized gospel,
Sure.
but we don't have a very fleshed gospel.
Sure.
We don't have a very a gospel that tells stories and
Yeah.
implicates emotions and causes us to have to take a good look at oneself as well as one's environment. And I think the arts, I think creativity, I think imagination, which I think is within us all because we bear the image or the imagination of God in all of us. And so it's one aspect that we don't really give much credence to, much conversation or much learning for. So I think creating space for those type of Enneagram 4 type people,
Sure.
I think is really important, especially in today's climate. Because we have such a very creative climate today. A very entrepreneurial, very imaginative cultural climate today. And I hope that constantly finds release within the context of the Christian faith.
So I grew up in a context that was really heavy on the word. Mm-hmm. So doctrinal clarity, doctrinal allegiance. And I'm hearing you say that it's this other aspect, this more kind of holistic, artistic aspect that also has a place at the table when we think about how Christianity is expressed. What do we lose if we have an overly dogmatic or an overemphasis on clarifying the right boxes and checking them off when it comes to our faith?
Yeah, I don't, as it relates to that, I'm not going to, jump on that necessarily as a negative. I think we need it, strong intelligence. Sure. I think we need the mind. Mm-hmm. But if it's only the mind, then all of who we are that makes us human suffers to some degree.
Sure.
And so I think for me, there needs to be space for a holistic understanding of the faith and how the faith is practiced and lived out. Yeah. And for it to only be about belief structures, I think we miss out on how does one live the life, not beyond the mind, but within the mind intact, but in a holistic fashion.
Sure, exactly. What recommendation would you give to a young leader who wants to, say, provide a space for the artistic element in their faith community to flourish? What have you seen to be helpful in that area?
Yeah, it can look probably many different ways, providing many different layers. I just think there just needs to be allowance and not permission. I don't think artists should find permission to be who they are.
Sure.
I think they just need an environment where they're allowed to be who they are and that to be nurtured and encouraged and welcomed. Yeah. I think that's first and foremost. I think we probably have so many different artists, and I'm not talking about, iconograph type of crosses are art or doves are art. I'm talking about truly thoughtful, interruptive storytelling through the different fine and physical art forms that I believe they need allowance.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And how does that work? Once again, I think that starts there. You've got to allow people to be their most unique selves in your setting. And I think, allowing them to explore the unique imaginative gifts that are within them to find resonance and then release in that space. And so in Ventura specifically, we weren't marketing to the artists. We weren't targeting to the artists. Sure. We weren't doing anything to objectify the artists. We were just being who we were, knowing that we have distinct values on how we wanted to embody our life together. And there was a natural pull and impulse towards the artist community that they found their way in with us. And then, once again, space was just created. We had our own film production company. We had an art gallery for the city. We created multiple artistic venues for expression and experience through different forms of art. So it was a big part of who we were then.
Yeah. Let's kind of come forward into the present now here at Alongsiders Church, formerly known as Portland Foursquare.
Yes, yes.
I'm curious about not only the name change, but about the way that you've utilized the space that we're in now in a way to be more effective in reaching your community.
Yeah. It's... I've tasted the church planting world, and I know the beauty and the challenges there. This is the first experience I've ever had in my years of ministry where I was invited to take on a responsibility for something that was already established. Okay. I think my natural tendency is always to create out of nothing. That's kind of how I'm wired. And so I live into that with a tremendous strength. So to enter into a space that has already been established, I mean, this church has been around since about 92 years, 93 years old. To come into this space was a challenge for me. I did not know if who I was would actually make sense for this community of people at that time specifically. So I've been here for almost 8 years, going on, this is my 8th year I've been here. And to go into something that was already here was a challenge for me and a challenge for those that were present here. But when you go into a space and literally you have a physical space to steward, when you have a church property or piece of property that you have to steward, then man, my idea is that number one, we're going to steward it well, but we're going to steward it well to the point where it has enough space and accessible points for other people to experience it and to be a part of it. And for it to be not just some sort of, building on the corner that doesn't pay taxes and that is hidden interior from the rest of the neighborhood. Sure. My whole focus and goal coming here was if I'm going to take on this responsibility, then this place is going to be known as a place that's open and available to all of my neighbors in this area. And they can testify fully that that is the case. We've worked really hard to create very organic relationships that have a tremendous reciprocal mutual respect here. And this space has definitely been used really as connecting community, a place for people to find belonging and use so that their efforts, dreams, initiatives can find further fuel. So this would be more of like at my early days as a church planter in this artistic community with the different fine and physical arts. This is a spatial art. If we can use it and design it in such a way that it has room for the art of relationship, then that is really key for me.
Fascinating. And just, can you give us a couple of specific examples for how designing a space to accent and accelerate relationships is made possible?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, it's all listening in the community. And when I came here, all of these neighbors, I listened, I met, we sat, we ate, we drank, we talked. And it was really just listening. What is this particular Northeast community that borders the Southeast population of people? So it's a very, Laurelhurst is up top. This is Kearns, you know what I mean? And so it's a very unique south side of the river. A lot of development hitting the south side of the river. Apartment complexes going up. We have one right backside of us, 119 unit being built. So there's a lot of activity, a lot of transitory experience and people coming in. So you have to listen. So we spent probably 3 to 4 years of just listening. And that was really important for us. And then slowly, either at moments you're going to innovate or you're going to adapt. And so we had a both and. At moments we innovated our space for what came out of our listening, and other times we had to adapt our space based on our listening. So it was making sure that listening was the groundwork of it all, and then we would respond based on what we were discerning through listening on what do we need to initiate with the resources that we have to initiate, i.e. you're sitting in the last part of the development of this space, which is to expand our neighbor's table, coffee, and common space, because we know the direction that we're going based on the conversations that we've had with this neighborhood of how this space can be used. Other portions of the space we adapted based on those conversations as well. So it's really a both and, at least that's what we've learned here is a both and, but listening is the bedrock for it all. You've got to listen well, really. It's not assuming on the neighborhood that you're in. It's not suggesting that somehow you are going to better the neighborhood just because you're here in a neighborhood. It's learning to do life with your neighbors in such a way that there's a mutuality that comes out of that, that though they might use different language, we see it as, man, these are just kingdom unique things that are just transpiring to really for the common good. They would just see it like this is really neighboring and the common good's all about. Different language, but I think the heart of it still sits within the essence of the heart of God.
My goodness. I love what you're saying about the importance of a lengthy season of listening and to not presume upon your own plan that comes in kind of from the top into a neighborhood.
Because, that's what happens. I mean, and, as you are a mentor and a guide and a director and somebody that leads young people, and some of these young people might have this overwhelming sense and pull of the Spirit to church plant, quote unquote, or create some community of faith or some sort of marketplace thing. Listening is key because we can be excited about what's being stirred in us, but that doesn't mean the neighborhood is going to be excided about it either.
Sure.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So you have to make sure that there's enough time where you've embedded yourself well enough to then figure out how will we embody ourselves well.
Yeah.
So if there's no embedding, then your embodying might just be about you and not necessarily about what God's doing in the neighborhood. So you've got to embed yourself through listening and active participation enough to figure out what does it mean for now us to embody ourselves well.
Yeah.
And really what neighborhoods are is just this relational environment that we all share.
I'm hearing you talk a lot about this idea of embedding first and then embodying. That starts with listening, a lot of humility, a lot of laying aside your preferences and agenda to really serve. What else would you say are some principles or lessons that you've learned in the years that you've spent ministering in an urban context that would be helpful for somebody who would get called towards a place like this or any place where there's a high density of people in a cultural experience?
I don't know if I've necessarily learned it. I can't, it's a great question that I probably have to ponder and come back to you on. So I think just for me, just kind of flick off a few things. I don't know if that would be helpful. But just from a pure relational aspect, I think in any relationships that we have that are beginning, we don't assume on the relationship.
Okay. What does that mean?
That I don't come in a relationship that we're just starting to have to assume on, hey, this is how I need this relationship to go.
Oh, okay.
Right? So as a young leader, church planner, or older, or whatever, whoever you might be, like, if you don't assume on the relationships that are beginning, then don't assume on the neighborhood or the city that you are being called to or directed to or living in, but you want to be a part of a certain environment with a certain people in a certain neighborhood, so forth. I think we just don't assume on people. I wouldn't assume a relationship on you and saying, hey, this is how this needs to go. Yeah. So let us not assume on a neighborhood expecting that, hey, we're here now, so we're going to go ahead and how this is how this needs to go.
Sure. Okay.
I just don't know. If Jesus could spend 30 years in what we have outside of this quick moment of him being a child and a birth, in obscurity, just from a scriptural standpoint.
Sure.
Obviously, he wasn't obscure. He was very involved in the neighborhood, but just what we have in the written text, there's an obscurity. I have no idea what he was up to, right? Yeah. But I'm pretty sure that in the same way that he was embedded, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. The traditions, the fabric of the environment, the relationships, all of those things were part and parcel to his own development. Then there's no reason why we can't take the time, right, to learn that as well, right?
It's almost what it sounds like is, in the same way that, say, if I was called overseas to a different culture, the same process of patiently waiting, not assuming, trying to do my best to enculturate, to leave my own preferences behind, to involve myself with reality as I see it. Do you find that that kind of missionary impetus, that same kind of desire to cross cultural boundaries, is helpful when thinking about ministry in an urban context?
Oh, absolutely. So, it's definitely, you have to explore, I think you always have to explore the good writing or the good history of both the fathers and the mothers, the monastics, the contemplative, the activists, and the modern versions. I think we have to look at the plethora of really gifts that we have to go, what does it look like to have a very keen and discernible sense of self when we are seeking to really participate in what God's already been up to. And I think that's key. I think that's really important, to just to be patient enough and to be present enough and to be awake enough to really the environment that you find yourself in.
Yeah.
And I think that's just the gift that will be understood by those in that context.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much that could be explored, and there's so much that's already out there that speaks of these things, which I celebrate. I would just say, harness the energy. You know what I mean?
Sure.
Harness the energy. Don't not be yourself, and don't not be who God is inviting you to become and discover about yourself in your ministry call in an urban setting, but harness that energy to be wise with how and who you are in environments, making sure that you're taking the practice of the listener. And I think Jesus, right? I always tell people, we've got this bumper sticker, and Jesus is the answer. Okay, whatever. But Jesus is the questioner.
Sure.
He's the greatest questioner
Yes.
The gospel writers say it alone. In Mark's gospel, it's 65 conversations, and 50 plus of those are questions that Jesus asks of somebody, or doesn't even answer the questions that asked of him.
Isn't that so infuriating about Jesus?
I love that, though, because it takes the pressure off of me to give answers to questions that I might need to go, let me probe a little bit more. Let me ask a little bit more. And I think that's the uniqueness of what we're offered in the urban climate, is that if we are just people that ask really good questions and listen really well, then there's a trust that gets created. And I think that's really important to live from.
Absolutely. What does neighboring mean to you, and how does it get expressed in your life?
Yeah, I mean, neighboring, I think it's like, I would say, if you have the opportunity to choose a partner, somebody you marry, that to me is like, in that type of proximity, is one of the hardest forms of discipleship. It really is. Like, I've learned more about myself based on the relationship that of almost 25 years with my wife, right?
Sure.
I see myself, and at times I don't like what I see, and at times I'm like, oh, I'm growing in this area. But when you're neighboring, there has a proximity to that, right? And the gift of neighboring is that it will teach you how conditional your love is.
Mm-hmm. Yes,
right?
yes.
How unaccepting you really are.
Yeah.
How unconsciously irritable you can become towards somebody that might do something, say something, park their car somewhere, leave their trash cans out, don't pick after their dog poop, or whatever the case may be. Neighboring has this proximity value to it as well that allows you to see yourself, right? Mm-hmm. So I think when Jesus says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, love your neighbor as yourself, the gift of that love commandment is not only will you discover love of neighbor, you're going to discover what it means to love yourself and be gentle enough with yourself, knowing that you're really going to miss the mark sometimes in loving your neighbor.
Wow. I always said that I thought I was a pretty nice guy, and then I got married. And I realized just how deep my selfishness and self-centeredness goes, in part just because of that proximity that you're talking about. And the beauty of neighboring is that it puts us into proximity with people, some of whom we may not choose to voluntarily associate with otherwise, and asks us perhaps to consider how we respond, what that says about us, and what a grace-centered response might look like in light of this.
And I think the neighbor, honestly, I think the neighbor will teach you what it means for you to care for yourself.
How so?
I think the things that will come up in you that you don't realize that are there, because I think that unconsciously, I think we still have this like I'm supposed to love my neighbor. So it's
Sure.
this outward thing.
Yeah.
And I think the more that relationship that starts to happen in the neighboring piece, I think what we begin to realize is like, oh, these are the areas that I need to grow into. These are the areas that I need to mature into. These are the areas that I'm seeing about myself. So the neighbor, unintentionally or intentionally, allows you a perspective that hopefully elicits your own self-care of like, oh, I need to pay attention to these areas in my life. I need to pay attention to these areas in my life. Or I'm really thankful that these parts in my life are at this point when I know that they weren't at this point.
Yeah.
So I think there's a self-care thing that through the reciprocation of neighboring, that I think is beautiful. And Jesus, the Good Samaritan is one of the most central stories of neighboring. And I think one thing that I really tell people all the time, and this connects to the laundry list narrative, but in that story, there's so many parts of it that we need to pay attention to. But one of the things that God really revealed to me 8-10 years ago was when the Samaritan took this individual to the inn in the story and says, here's a couple of weeks worth of whatever to take care of him. Yeah. Then he says, and when I return. Neighboring is all about returning.
Interesting.
It's all about returning. And from the Hebrew scriptures to the Christian ones, the emphasis on God constantly returning to us is revealed in Hesed, his loving kindness towards us in the Hebrew. And then we obviously see the incarnation of Hesed through the life of Jesus, which is this constant return with this promise of a return again. So we as a people, especially in our neighboring, need to be a people that return. That our neighboring is not just a one-off moment. We don't like run out of our gated environments and do a good thing and then run back in. But we keep an open commitment to return in our relationship, especially as it relates to neighboring.
That's really fascinating. You mentioned this idea about laundry love, which has been a key part of your ministry journey. Can you briefly kind of fill us in on the genesis of what, coming back to this idea of this, a life interrupted is a life inspired. What interrupted you to create what is now an organization that has provided over, 1 million loads of clean laundry around the world?
Yeah. Well, that was a group interruption. I don't think we were expecting the relationships that we had created in California. They were very real, very organic. We didn't really programatize our relationships. We were just ultimately present, and those relationships blossomed out of us continuing that way of life, committed to a form of presence. And it was one of those conversations. Eric was his name, went by T-Bone on the street, that just basically said, if I had clean clothes, I think people would treat me as a human being. So
if I had clean clothes, I think people would treat me as a human being.
And that was based on his experiences, that because he couldn't wash his clothes and the smell that was attached to his clothes, people had an idea of who he was. They put a label or a construct around him. Fear was automatically created based on what he looked like, what he smelled like, so forth and so on. And so that simple statement, that simple want, was really the interruptive moment for us to go, And that's what kind of took us on this great adventure of working with one local laundromat in that Ventura area and saying, hey, can we come in at this time to wash the clothes of our friends? And they were a great partner. That space is still being used to this day, almost 16 years later, for that very thing. And then this was we had never meant it to become this neighboring movement, if you will. It just had this natural, organic, and we chose to keep it an open source idea and operation for people. And then it turned into this much larger thing, which we're so grateful and humbled by. It's been a phenomenal journey.
Wow.
But it's all about the laundromat and the post office are probably some of the only spaces left where you can meet the world.
Yeah.
Culturally, racially, economically, is those two spots. And you have nothing but time in a laundromat.
That's true.
And so
Yeah.
you have the opportunity to listen to stories and people, and when trust is built, more is offered. And when more is offered, you learn to companion them beyond clean clothes. You learn to tutor children. You learn to help with job placement, housing placement. You learn to work towards helping undocumented peoples find ways to become documented peoples. I mean, the list can go on and on and on, and it has in so many different of our Laundry Love efforts. Natural disasters, there's Laundry Love locations that are happen beyond, a couple weeks. There's extended months of helping people with their clothes. So, and this happens all in a third place that people love to talk about. It's just a laundromat, and you have nothing but time in there. So it's amazing what things can happen.
Fascinating. I know that you're a huge reader, and I'm going to ask you an impossible question, but can you try to, maybe give a couple of recommendations or things that are top of mind that really helped influence the kind of leader that you've become today?
Yeah. Well, I think relationships are just as key as reading. So I think there are key relationships in my life.
It's a good reminder
that help me become who I am today.
Yeah, sure.
First and foremost. And I can definitely name them on the top of on my fingers. But from a reading perspective, I think some of the reading, I think Jean Vanier was one of the most, I don't know if you know much about Jean Vanier.
I've never heard the name. I'm sorry.
Real quick. Jean Vanier is the founder of Flourish, which means, that's French, which means in English, the Ark. And there's over 100 communities of L'Arche. And L'Arche is a place for severely mentally and physically disabled peoples. And Jean Vanier is the founder of that. Henry Nouwen is Henry Nouwen because of that.
Oh, interesting.
So he went to Toronto after his university stint as professor, and he went to Toronto and became one of the pastors of L'Arche in Toronto. So everything that you get from the spiritual writer Henry Nouwen is because of his introduction into Jean Vanier's world. So Jean Vanier became an important figure to me, and has ever since. And he's definitely older in years now, but he's been a beautiful, beautiful figure to me. Dorothy Day, the Catholic activist, was a huge part of my development as a leader and as a person. I think Father Gregory Boyle has become a very, very important voice for me personally. So I definitely sit myself probably, and I mean my master's degree is all about this, but I sit within the contemplative and the activist traditions, mainly because that's kind of how I'm wired. But then there's a lot of work, from a leadership perspective, as it relates to making sure that you're in touch with yourself, which is really important. So I think, for those that might not know, I think the Enneagram pathways and processes are really helpful for you to see the whole of who you are, know the good and the bad, and pay attention to the shadow and the parts of you that need your attention so you don't do harm. That's one thing I think one specific professor really constantly said: do no harm in ministry. If those can be the three letters that you live with, do no harm.
Wow.
And so I think making sure that you're reading stuff that allows you to be self-aware, attentive, and grow into your personhood, so you do no harm, and the leadership capacities that are in us all, making sure that we do no harm. And then just things that I think just align with my nature nurture person.
Sure.
So.
You mentioned finishing just recently a master's degree from Portland Seminary. Congratulations.
Thank you.
What lessons do you think you learned about trying to handle the increased heavy academic load while not losing sight of kind of the presence and the Spirit of Christ within?
That's a great question. I imagine some of your students are trying to finding that hard.
I'm still trying to figure that one out.
That's a great question. I think it's just the fact that if the psalmist had anything right to say, which I think a lot of them did, and I think Psalm 139, that I can't go anywhere without you being present. Oh. You know what I mean? Like, no matter if I go into my academia world and stuck inside my isolated self trying to study and complete papers and get ready for tests. God is there.
Yeah.
You know, if he can be on the far side of the ocean or the depths here and the heights there, then God is always found in every single moment of life. It's just us that need to wake up to that. So for all of your students, it's hard. It's a challenge. It's a challenge not to become dry or apathetic, but be reminded that God is present each and every day. We don't have to somehow ask for him to be present. We don't have to do something for him to be present. We just need to wake up to the fact that he's constantly here.
Yeah.
He's present to us all the time. That's what Psalm 139 offers us, is the complete reminder. There's nothing I can do to somehow hide myself from who you are.
Ah, so beautiful.
You know?
Yeah.
So
let's finish with just any last words of wisdom or things that you want to impart to young ministers looking to make a difference for the kingdom of God.
Yeah, I think, number one, I applaud you knowing what it's been like to be there. And you're living in the first half of life. I imagine most of your students are, 20s?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So you're in the first half of life. You're still learning about yourself. Don't ever stop learning about yourself. Don't ever stop learning about yourself. I think there's going to be enough energy for you to pursue whatever God uniquely calls you to. But don't stop learning about you. You still have to grow up. You still have to mature. And I say that because I am still growing up. I'm still having to mature. So sometimes I don't know if there's enough emphasis on the formation of your life, the formation of yourself, letting your own life speak and paying attention to what it's saying, because God is active in that. God is active in your life and through your life. So making sure that you're just taking the time to be responsible for you is really important, I think, because ministry has an alluring light to it. And we can be like little insects that get stuck in the light and zap, right? So you've just got to pay attention. You've got to make sure that you are doing what you need, the practices, the disciplines, the things that are going to make you grounded and awake to what's going on in your own life.
Wonderful.
So,
all right, Pastor Greg, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks.
This has been a delightful conversation.
Thanks for coming out here to the beautiful northeast of Portland to do it.
It's delightful. Okay, God bless. Appreciate you.
You too.